So, Ms. Martina, thank you so much for joining us. Can you please briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Well, I'm from Germany. I'm a geologist by training, but also a historian of science. I'm 57 years old, a mother of 2 children. And I'm also Secretary General of INHIGIO, the International Commission for the History of Geological Sciences, a long-standing commission of the IOGS.
Thank you so much. So can you tell us a little bit more, right before we start, about the INHIGEO, so a little bit about that organization and what its mission is?
INHIGIO is there to promote interest in the history of the geosciences, and it collects members from all over the globe. And it brings together a really diverse community of geoscientists interested in history of their science, but also historians of science. And so we are truly interdisciplinary. And since not all countries do have professional historians of geosciences, we also welcome amateurs as well, so they're professionals and amateurs alike. And I started as an amateur of history of geosciences.
That is awesome. Yes, interdisciplinarity is what Earth Science Matters really seeks to promote with the help of these events. So this is a perfect segue into asking you about how you started your journey, because this is such an amazingly unique field or subfield of geoscience, and the blend between the humanities aspect of history and, you know, this really rigorous geological work that you have been doing. How did the idea first come to you? How did your journey begin?
In history, well, that was very strange. I was a completely normal geoscientist, trained at university. But I was also always interested in museums and science communication. And when I joined the group to promote equal opportunity for women in geosciences, we noted that there is hardly any known role models, or at least at that time there weren't any known role models. And so we decided to have a showcase in the museum at the university in Tübingen, making little exhibitions on women in geology and historical women in geology. And we also published little brochures. And these, for some reason, found their way into the United Kingdom, where a real historian got interested and contacted me. And that's how I got into INHIGIO. I became a member eventually, and started to actually research and publish more thoroughly history of the geosciences, actually starting with women in geosciences, but then also moving on to other topics such as geology and religion. I have a huge project right now, history of geology in Nazi Germany and in the Cold War era. And I have written a book on history of impact crater geology, things like that. So it's a very diverse field, and I'm doing it now since the mid-1990s. So for quite some time now.
Tell us a little bit about that moment in which you discovered what it was like to study the history of the geosciences. Like, what was that? What was that process? Did you feel like it was a very underrated field? Did you feel that that was something that was didn't receive the attention that it deserved in the public side?
At least my impression in Germany at that time was that if you looked into history of science, there were lots of people researching history of physics and chemistry and biology and so on. But the geosciences were really underrated. There was literature about history of mining, things like that. But geoscience research, not so much. And it was more in the Anglo-Saxon world, where I discovered colleagues who would research, for instance, history of paleontology or stratigraphy. And from that on, I got to know more and more people. And well, over the decades, the field has become really diverse, and everybody is interested in different things. So there's a lot of literature right now where you can actually look into. And well, as to training, I never trained as a historian, but I found my training as a geoscientist quite valuable, because if you do history of the Earth, you also deal with historical sources, your fossils. And I still tend to treat my historical sources very much as I would treat fossils or rocks that also share their history, if you know how to listen to them. The only real difference is that the fossil cannot lie, and it doesn't have any intentions. So there is some difference, of course, if you have a written source, but the scientific training as a geologist or paleontologist really helps with also dealing with historical questions, and then you learn from other people.
Wow, that is amazing. And what are you working on right now? So you've discovered your interest, you've gotten in touch with people who share that expertise or that field. And where has that work taken you up to this point?
Right now, I'm working on a monograph about the history of geology in Germany between 1933 and 1945, so basically during the Nazi regime, how geology was affected by that political regime, in what geoscientists did actually, in terms of lending their expertise to this totalitarian state, providing resources for war. On the other hand, there were people who even tried to transform their science into some ideologically tainted version of science. And then, of course, there are the people. So you have everything from victims, Jewish geoscientists who had to flee Germany or were even murdered. And on the other hand, you have, well, unpolitical people, as so-called unpolitical people who just try to go along. And then you have the actual perpetrators who, well, were enthusiastic about the regime and were anti-Semites and well, really ugly, bad persons. And it's really interesting to research all that. And we have a huge wealth of information in the archives, letters and statements. So it's not just public sources, but also real private letters, which show how people thought and what they tried to do or actually did, and how they later tried to camouflage their involvement.
Thank you so much. Now, can that be said for other historical time periods? I want to give our audience now a chance to zoom out and think about the broader picture of what the history of geosciences looks like. So can you please address that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you look at the history of the geosciences, you have basically three roots. There is natural history, the interest in fossils and stratigraphy. And then there is natural philosophy. So people tended to write theories of the earth, which recounted a history of the earth, but also quite a lot of processes, geological processes, talking about earthquakes and volcanoes and so on. And then there is the third would be the history of mining, looking for resources or deposits and so on. And all this basically came together, starting in the Renaissance time, but really coming together in the 18th and 19th centuries to form what we would now call the geosciences. And during all that time, geosciences was also very important for the general worldview. So if you look back into history, you have science also influence how people thought about their place on this earth and in their history. And if you look back very, very far back, you would, the age of astronomy, or these days we might think we have the age of climate research and artificial intelligence, and before that we had the age of life sciences or whatever. And the early 19th century was basically the age of the geosciences, of geology, where people were thinking about expanding their view of time and distinguishing between an earth history and a human history, and an earth history that would be much, much longer than human history. And then also their relationship with other organisms, so evolution and how things changed throughout the Earth history, and that made geology a fashionable science in the 19th century. So everybody was interested in these. So not just like today, children loving dinosaurs, but everybody loved these fossils and the implications they had on the worldview. So it was something people became enthusiastic about, and they all collected minerals and fossils and rocks and looked out into the field.
So let me try to ask this. Does that mean that there were times in history where the history of geosciences was not studied, like it was not given at all the importance that, for example, it was given in the 19th century?
Well, the history of the geosciences basically starts in the 19th century, so that the people researching the history of the geosciences, first you need to have geoscience before you can start the history of the geosciences. But the geosciences go way back, and of course they have roots in non-scientific cultures as well. So for instance, in mythology or in religious use, or just, collecting resources. If you pick up a rock, just to use it forever, for whatever you want to use it, even for building, for instance, you need to know something about how rocks work and so on. And so there is no time when the people didn't know anything about geology, even though they wouldn't call it that.
Yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense. So we have virtually for all human history as we know it, people have interacted with the natural environment, therefore with the lithosphere, hence with the geology. But starting with the 19th century is what I'm hearing, that really the study of the history of geosciences, or the history of the interaction of human society with geology, really begins to explode. Now, is there a reason for why is it the 19th century? Why is it that people became interested in the history of the geosciences, particularly then? Or in other words, what was the use of it that those people draw from?
Well, they basically got interested in their own roots. And once you establish a new science like the geosciences, and people work at universities and museums and so on, you have to get some sort of professionalization. They also start to think about where they came from. So it slowly grows into also people thinking about the history of what they are doing. I think that's basically what it is, just a general interest in their own history, just like you would do the history of anything else. But of course, for me, it's not just being interested in the history of my own science, but it also, I think, helps me to understand how my students think. Because if you have students coming directly from school, they tend to have quite similar problems as you can see in the history of geology. Because much of teaching is also about making people look in a specific way. And you have to teach that to people. And when they come from school, they don't have that. And so they have really, really very similar problems in understanding what you would tell them, as you would find, for instance, in the 19th century. And I also find that looking at problems with a historical perspective helps me to understand where the actual problem lies and how it came to be. It just expands my own idea or feeling about how I think about what I do as a scientist. So being a historian as well somehow enriches what I do.
Can you illustrate that point with an example? So I'm talking about the difficulty that you encountered. That was very interesting.
Yeah. For instance, I teach a course on general geology, and it is also about petrography, so hand specimens. And I do have here just a rock like this, yeah, and it's what is called a Mellafür, and they tend to confuse phenocrysts with bubble fillings. They don't see that it's something completely different in terms of genesis and what they tell about the rock. And this is just an example which was hotly debated at some time in the history. All these things you see in that rock, are they of the same kind? Or is this different stages in the history of that rock? And my students just make the same mistakes as early geologists did as well, because it is actually difficult to understand that there are several processes shaping that piece of rock.
Especially when you're used to seeing it as just a piece of rock. I mean, when you're not trained, your eyes are not trained to see the distinction. Okay, before we move on to the next question, here in the chat, Ms. Martina, so if you would want to see the question for yourself, you can, I suppose you can read that. So Ms. Courtney is asking, do you see a difference in the way field notes and information are being captured from the past to today? Is there a reduction in detail or an enhancement in the digital era?
Well, I think it very much depends on the person who is doing things. There have always been people who look in great details, other try to do it more generalized, and it depends on purpose what you use your field notes for. Just as I said right now with the example of the rock, it also is important what kind of theory or pre-knowledge you have in your mind. And that also shapes, of course, what you would slot down and what you would neglect. And for those people who do it for the first time, it's really, really difficult to decide what's actually important and what can be neglected. And we have that problem all the time throughout the centuries. And it doesn't basically change from doing it with a pencil or doing it with a camera or in some sort of digital way. It's always a question of, deciding what's important and what not. And it's always the people who do it for the first time who have all these huge problems in making up their minds. And it's really admirable how much they thought about this process of deciding as well, and in how much time was actually spent in discussing and having an argument, even fighting with colleagues about these issues. But it seems necessary, and we will continue to do that.
Yes, building on Ms. Courtney's question, I just had a thought that popped into my mind. There is, though, a big difference between the digital era and, for example, the 19th century. For example, the extent to which we can be exposed to different points of views, be that political bias or any other type of maybe cultural bias. Do you see a difference between the bias that people have brought into geoscience, the amount of bias that they have brought or been able to bring perhaps into geoscience, for example, during the Second World War in Germany, and for example, later, right now? Is there a difference?
I think it's less a difference in terms of time. It's a difference in terms of isolation or diversity. So if you are brought up in a society that's very much isolated, and that's what happens in totalitarian state, then your mind will never be as broad as someone who is used to diversity. And I think having diversity, and not just in terms of having various ideas, of having seen lots and lots of rocks and outdrops and things like that, but also being able to discuss with people of diverse backgrounds. So in terms of gender, I don't know, skin color, whatever, you name it. Yeah. The more diverse the scientific community is, the more rich will it be, and the more will it be able to discuss and argue and find an answer, an answer that will be, well, a general answer that is valid for the whole globe and for everybody. And that's basically what science is all about, to find general answers.
Yes, and this is a wonderful opportunity. I think it's not only useful, but also just amazing when we have so many people across the world who can share the same passion, and in spite of maybe different backgrounds or different circumstances, to just share the same interest for a global history of geosciences. So, okay, that was a great detour, but coming back to discussing history and geology, coming back to our sort of timeline that we've drawn, starting from the 19th century, people have become more and more involved with studying the history of geosciences. They found out about their roots, the different interactions between human society and geology. Now, how has that changed, if it has changed, the way in which society works? So has there been any practical revolution, so to speak, in the way society works from the moment that the history of geosciences has become a more or less mainstream subject?
Well, there was a huge influence of the geosciences in terms of general philosophy of thinking about one's own place on the globe, in history. If you have a very limited time span, or if you think humans are just the crown of creation or whatever, then you have a different outlook than if you realize that you are part of something greater and of nature in general, that you are related to all that there is, and that humans might be only a transient feature. And that was a sense that had to be gained throughout the history of the geosciences. And that maybe now will return or again become important to realize when we look into the future. Now that we have finally realized the importance of climate change. It took quite a long time. I remember in the 1980s, I was already writing school papers about climate change. So it was around for quite some time, but it was much realized in the media or in politics, and now it actually seems to be there and to stay. And now again, I think we need that perspective that we are dependent on everything else on this planet, and in terms of resources, in terms of climate, in terms of biodiversity and everything else. And that is something that needs to be felt in order to be able to change and become one with the planet.
I thank you so much for sharing that perspective. I found several points to be very interesting. And particularly a couple of moments before we were talking about the diversity and many different backgrounds and how they help enhance our common understanding of geosciences. Now, you've touched on this prior, but you've studied the connection between religion, different cultures, and geoscience. Now, for example, I personally believe that humans are the crown of creation, and I have my religious perspective on that, which I could support, but this goes way beyond any scope of this session. So how do we reconcile people who maybe have differing perspectives based on their religion, but are still interested in the amazing field of geoscience? How do we find a place for them?
It's important to discuss and talk to each other, and that's what I also implied by talking about diversity. It's important to share views, but it's also important to distinguish various levels of thinking. So one is plain science, and the other is more metaphysical, is philosophical, maybe religious, and so it's important to distinguish these levels and not to confuse plain science with more philosophical issues. And then we can again discuss and see how it works. And when I say that I personally don't believe that we are the crown of creation, I mean to imply by that I very much feel to be connected to all other entities of this globe. The tree of life is something which is very important to my personal spirituality, if you talk about spirituality now. So I'm not talking as a scientist right now, but more like as a spiritual person. Yeah? And these are things we can also share and discuss and see what it implies about religious views. And there are so many different types of spirituality and religious views around that is also very interesting, and see how it influences our way of doing science, for instance.
Yes, ma'am. I love what you said. Now, would you like to maybe share some thoughts on the connection between religion and geoscience? Because I personally know very little about that, and I think that is very interesting.
For these days, if you look, at least in Central Europe, where I live, people seem to be more and more secular and not so much interested in religions. But if you go into other parts of the globe, this will rapidly change. And particularly if you go into the past, there is hardly anywhere someone who would say, I'm an atheist, for instance. So people were very much both scientists and religious persons. And you need an understanding of that if you do history of science as well, because it was an integral, important part of people's lives. And we had, for instance, a meeting, a conference by Inhigio in, 2007, about geology and religion, and we published a thick book with that topic with the Geological Society of London.
Wow.
It brought together people from all over the globe and from different religions as well, to contribute to that topic, and it was really, really interesting.
Wow, I didn't know that. That is so interesting. And I assume, of course, I don't think even part, I assume the majority of the scientists in the 19th century were in one way or another greatly motivated by their religious beliefs. Even, the infamous Isaac Newton, he was also a very faithful Christian. So that is indeed very interesting, that you can also add this nuance to the integral of what history of geosciences is all about. Okay, but coming back to, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add maybe that if you do history of scientific discipline, it's not just how this discipline develops, it's also about the people who do it and their background, their context. And religion is just part of this context, or the political context, is also very important, or the question of whether everybody is allowed to participate. So are women allowed to be scientists at a particular time, and so on? And how is racism influencing what people are doing, whatever. So you need the whole context. It's not just recounting or telling a story about how a particular science like the geosciences develop. It's also about the social, the historical, the political context of people who did it, lived in. Mm-hmm. So it's much more than just telling a simple story.
Thank you. And we're still doing that today. We're still, as far as I understand, and InHiGeo is part of the effort to try and understand and bring all the information about the current landscape of geoscientists. Now, where would you like to see this vision go into the future? How would the symbiosis between history and geosciences, where could it ideally bring us from your perspective?
Well, the field has grown so much, and there are so many people, and they put up together so many details. I don't think I can say where it's going. It's branching and branching. It's a huge tree of different people doing different things that may or may not overlap. So it's branching all the time. So it's a very fruitful field, and that's just what we do in science as well. Creating more and more questions and diversity, and that's what makes it so wonderful. See it grow.
Okay, one more question. Thank you for that answer. So is there a notable point in history that you can think of that we can learn most from for now? And just a second, Zoom is not cooperating. So is there a notable point in history that you can think of that we can learn most from for now, and how we address our challenges in the future?
Oh, well, I don't think I would like to name a specific single point, but I always felt controversy is quite interesting. Maybe it's just because it's just me, I don't know. But when people argue and debate hotly, and I also have a fable for losers of an argument, I find their way of arguing often quite interesting. And it gives us sometimes an idea how difficult it actually is to finally come to terms, and, well, after lots and lots of debate, to again reach consensus, and then going on to the next problem and stumble across something new. So it's not a smooth transition from a smooth story of progress. Although in general, of course, we do have progress. We know now more than we did in the past. That is out of the question, I think. But it sometimes needs to really be argued about and discussed and thought about. Yeah, and these times in history, or these particular topics, are always really interesting, and they tell us how people function, and how a personal background has an impact of what they do as a scientist. So maybe the lecture for the future is the lesson for the future is that we all have our context, and not just, well, eggheads and always objective, and so things need to be addressed in their context as well. And sometimes we need a little patience with the other who might be of a different opinion. As to the future, I think maybe if we would come back in a few decades, and people would discuss the recent history of the geosciences, I feel that what is right now changing is that from all the specialization which took place during the course of my career, for instance, that people have specialized branching and then looking at small details. And now we have coming back all these specialized fields again to look at the Earth as a general system, and not just the lithosphere, but the atmosphere coming, and the biosphere, and so on, and putting all the big picture again back in. And that might again increase the relevance of the geosciences. And I would love to come back in a few decades decades, probably after my death, and to read a general history of the geosciences of this time now as a starting point where all these specialists again come together and put their whole diversity into something that will grow and become a different view of the globe.
Thank you so much. And can you maybe, like, in a sentence or really shortly, this would be a challenge for you, ma'am, can you provide a message in view of the recent Earth Day that we had this past Saturday? So what would be your message for the globe in terms of the history of geoscience?
Well, Earth is so wonderful, and it's such great fun to study this globe, and I just would love to wish you all that you have also fun in studying it, and well, I would encourage people to discuss and come together and join their various diverse views to form a scientific community.
Thank you so much. This is it for the recorded part of our event. Thank you so much for all of those who are watching us now on YouTube and then other social media platforms. There will be similar events like this in the future, so please, if you want to write in questions live, make sure you register whenever those registrations are open and advertised to you. So let's thank again Dr. Martina for participating in this event.
Thank you for listening.